So what I'd like to do is to show you at least a few of the steps I've taken so far in researching the Reconciliation Project for my home church, St. Barnabas, and I've also done some work on St. Stephen's in San Luis Obispo. Rob Keim, our rector, provided me with an early history of the church, which still exists. It's a Roman Catholic mission in nearby Oceano, and here's a sample page from that history. So that was definitely a starting point. Rob also provided me with a list that I've begun to study of the founders of this beautiful church in San Luis Obispo, St. Stephen's. Among the most distinguished of the lay founders was Benjamin Brooks, who would for many years be the editor of the San Luis Obispo Tribune. On the same kind of people in the list of Arroyo Grande founders, I see at least 3 streets that are named after these families, 2 schools that are named after teachers from these families. One of those families provided 4 daughters married within St. Barnabas, and in a way they were the real launching pad for the church. But I want to focus on just one name to give you an idea of what the original members of St. Barnabas were like. Clara Edwards Paulding, and she was careful to keep her maiden name. She was descendant of the Puritan divine Jonathan Edwards. Here she is at Mills College in Oakland. She's an example of one of the citizens prominent in the history of both Arroyo Grande and St. Barnabas. She taught school here for over 40 years. Here she is in 1898. Rode her bike from town to teach at the 2-room branch schoolhouse in the upper Arroyo Grande Valley. I'm the little fellow in the inset. I would walk through that doorway to begin my formal education 60 years after this photo was taken. Clara was the daughter of a missionary, one of the founders of Cal Berkeley, and she was an organist and led choirs. Here she is in the oval at the entrance to the old St. Barnabas, the one that's today a mission. She also led the choirs of the Methodist and Presbyterian churches. She's very ecumenical. She was, however, an agnostic. She just liked church. And Ancestry.com is an invaluable source for finding out more about either your ancestors or people like Clara Dudley Edwards Paulding. And as I alluded to earlier, she kept Edwards among her names on her tombstone in our local cemetery. I remember teaching Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, that infamous sermon. I'm told that several members of the congregation fainted before he got to the good part at the end and talked about God's love and forgiveness. But this is a remarkable record of a remarkable life. She taught school here for over 40 years, as I mentioned, and she was one of the founders of the high school, helped it struggle through its early years. The wife of the town doctor, their home, which still exists today, during the 1918 flu, became Arroyo Grande's hospital. So she was a generous and giving woman, and she was especially fond of branch school kids. Of course, that's a plug for my school. Now, Ancestry.com is important. So are these 2 newspaper collections. I find that newspapers.com is much more user-friendly. It requires a subscription, but I've used that as much or more than I've used Ancestry.com in my research. This is an article from the 1930s. And I think the photographer caught Clara when she was milking a cow or something. She was not grumpy at all. She, in fact, loved children. This was just a bad moment. It's important to find out what you can, I think, about the Native Americans in your area. There are several sites for our people, the northern Chumash, or Yaktichutichu Yaktilini, the people who lived in San Luis Obispo County for 10,000 years before Europeans came. This is a marvelous website. There are several others, but this one is rich in history and culture. What was more helpful in the research were university archives. This is a master's thesis on Chumash people from Cal Poly. JSTOR is a scholarly journal. It requires a subscription, and you can find all kinds of information about the people I was looking for, the Northern Chumash.
Yak Itutio, Yak Itutio.
Tziltkawayu, place of the horses, Cambria. Eloeche, named for swordfish, Paso Robles. Chilcucunich, place of the rabbits, Carrizo Plain. Tilhini, place of the full moon, cultural capital of San Luis Obispo. Tziltkawa, place of the dogs, Morro Bay. Nipumu, place of the big house, Nipomo. Tzitpratu, place of the whales, Avila.
I was lucky in another way. I got to teach these two young women who are direct descendants of Rosario Cooper. One of the areas to consider in the interaction between whites and indigenous people is the disposition of artifacts and human remains. Newspapers.com provided several examples of what plainly could be called desecration. The dean of San Luis Obispo County Historians is Dan Krieger. In this column, he writes about northern Chumash remains that somehow appeared at a medical college in Birmingham, England. In the 1890s, a water main was being built in San Luis Obispo downtown near the old mission. And to make way for it, the Indian burial ground, many of them victims of the 1850s cholera epidemic, was unearthed, and no one is quite sure of what became of those people's remains. In founding clergy for both St. Barnabas and St. Stephen's, I'm trying to cross-check to see if there's any potential connection between any of them and the so-called Indian schools. This shows an interactive map of those in Canada and the United States. So far, no luck. The Saudi Inez Chumash to the south of us, some of them did go to an Indian school. This was a non-sectarian school, however, in Riverside.
Recently, Beatrice visited with her family and spent time with Amanda Wixon, assistant curator and PhD student with a research emphasis in Indian boarding schools.
When she came in, she brought her family and she stayed for about 3 or 4 hours. Some of her family were very unfamiliar with the boarding school system, so I started with a very basic overview of Indian policy at that time and why the boarding schools came about, and then talked about the time when Bea was here. She looked at some of the old pictures and she had very positive things to say. She looked at the buildings. We talked a lot about the buildings and how they looked and some of the jobs she had here. She has such a wonderful attitude anyways on life in general. I think she took some of the more negative aspects and saw some of the other aspects that we could pull from it a little more positive.
For students, most of the time at Sherman was spent working and learning trades. Classroom learning only took place for about 2 hours per day.
I worked at the hospital, and I worked with a dentist, with the superintendent cleaning his house.
Beatrice's time at Sherman was interrupted when a major change came to the campus.
One big change was in 1946, we became the Navajo program. The California Indian kids were mandated to go to public school, and they let the ones that were attending stay to graduate, but they just didn't bring any more in.
Bea came at a very transitional time. She was the last of the California tribes, and she was actually kicked out in favor of the Navajos, but she was involved in the intake of Navajo students, which is highly unusual. She was in charge of receiving them, combing out their hair, changing their clothes. She was supposed to watch over them.
The Navajos used to have a little pit out in the dormitory, and they'd make fry bread on Sundays. It was so good, it was 10 cents each. Met some nice people.
The goal of schools like the Sherman Institute was to eliminate and replace all traces of previous culture, including religion, diet, and language. Students would be punished if caught practicing any of these cultural traditions.
Bea is one of the many students that reports going into the groves or in trees or hidden areas to speak their language.
Forced assimilation is rarely successful, and like in so many other instances, the Indian boarding school story became one of survival and adaptability.
We make the best out of everything we're given, and that's how our people are.
By 1970, Sherman Institute had become Sherman Indian High School and is now a place where Native culture is taught and celebrated.
By the
I went back to Ancestry.com, but not for individuals this time, but for a study of the census, in this case, San Luis Obispo County in 1860 and again in 1870. Here you can see a big family identified by the patriarch as Indian. He is a servant. The overwhelming majority of those identified as Indian are also servants in both censuses. It's also interesting to note where they live. You don't have an address, of course, in the census, but you do have a dwelling number. And you can see that these people would live very close to each other. Also found out about 30 to 40 individuals identified as Indian. That doesn't mean there weren't more, in both 1860 and 1870. But there was an incredible anomaly. None of the surnames from 1860, not one, survived into the 1870 census. There was a horrific drought in our area between 1862 and 64 that nearly destroyed the cattle industry. And my guess is that many of those people were connected to that industry as vaqueros or as servants. and that must have caused a tremendous amount of outward movement from Arroyo Grande and San Luis Obispo County. University archives are a wonderful source. This is from Cal Poly. I cited a master's thesis from Cal Poly earlier, but this is, unfortunately, it's only available at the library and it's not online. But these are arrest and booking records from San Luis Obispo County. Some of them include mugshots, in fact, and that's another potential source for trying to determine what kind of interaction there was between the law and local Native Americans. And if you can find an individual who had a run-in with the law from an area near or in your home parish, it's also possible to find that person's booking photos online. They're available after a Google search on several different websites or on Ancestry.com. This man from San Diego would eventually be hanged at San Quentin. David also suggested looking at the records of the 1850 state legislature and the passing of the law, the California law for the governance and protection of Indians, which stripped them of nearly all civil rights and made minors, in particular, subject to indentured servitude. This is our assemblyman, Henry Teft. We have a Teft Road in Nepomos, south of here, named for him. He had the good luck to be called to a judgeship in San Luis Obispo County and left the day before the state legislature voted on that so-called Indian law. He drowned in San Luis Bay 2 years later. So it goes. I suppose I should be grateful for it. I didn't find any direct evidence of, say, a St. Barnabas founder mistreating local Native Americans. But I did find a man named Horatio Gates Trussell, who's the grandfather of one of St. Barnabas founders who lived in the upper Arroyo Grande Valley. Here's how he became involved. The man on the left is named George Nidover. He once tried to start a ranch in the Wasna Valley, east of Arroyo Grande, gave up after killing his 200th grizzly bear in a year, moved to Santa Barbara. He was involved in the so-called rescue of the woman on the right. Maria Juana was a Nicoleña woman. She lived by herself on one of the Channel Islands near Santa Barbara until she was found by Nidover and brought ashore, where she promptly died. She's buried with the Nidover family, but it was Mr. Horatio Gates Trussell who, according to Nidover, offered $1,000 if he could exhibit Juana Maria as a curiosity in San Francisco. Luckily, Nidover turned him down, but her story eventually became the basis for the award-winning juvenile novel, Island of the Blue Dolphins.